Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Listening to old radio broadcasts and recordings is a reminder that the Australian accent and our figures of speech change over time. Our accent is a reflection of our identity and marks us as distinct from other speakers of the English language, be it British, American, South African, or even New Zealand. Australians on the radio 80 years ago sounded much more British than they do today. Multicultural Australia and levels of education and cultural trends all contribute to the way we sound. Joining me to discuss the history of the Australian accent is Associate Professor Amanda Laugesen, who is Director of the Australian National Dictionary Centre at the ANU. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Georgina.
It's great to have you on our podcast, and I really have enjoyed preparing for this topic. It's so fascinating, particularly the debates in the 30s and 40s about what was an Australian accent and what should be an Australian accent. But tell me, Amanda, what is that cultural significance of our accent, of the Australian accent?
I think we very much identify with our unique accent and our unique lexicon. So I think language goes a long way to being part of our national identity. Arguably, we might have a national costume if you count the akubra or maybe stubbies and thongs. But you think about what it is that actually defines us as Australian. One of the things I think that we would say would be our accent and the unique words and expressions that we use. And I think that's something we think about here at home, but I think also something that we think about when we travel abroad. The way in which people see us, our iconic figures like Paul Hogan and Steve Irwin and those kinds of characters who are kind of the exaggeration, I suppose, of Australian stereotype. I think the accent and the lexicon are really important in terms of how we define ourselves.
It's interesting when you travel overseas, especially when you've been away for a long time and then you come across an Australian accent. It's I find it a visceral reminder of home, and you have that lovely sense of familiarity and I guess comradeship that, you might not know this person, you might have absolutely zero in common, but at least you can strike up a conversation just because of that. I find listening to the announcement at an Australian airport after coming home after a long time is incredibly comforting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think being able to hear that sound and to hear those words that we think of as uniquely Australian, yeah, you're right, can be really comforting and very much an identifier, something that we identify with our home.
So the Australian accent is something we can identify quite clearly now, but 200 odd years ago, there was no such thing. In terms of the English speakers in Australia at the time, they would have been English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish. But when did this Australian English accent develop?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research into the development of the accent. And I think the consensus seems to be that what happens is a process called dialect levelling. So you have a fairly small group of European, mostly English people who come to Australia in those early days, in those early decades. And between them, they're speaking with lots of dialect accents, but that process whereby they all start to move, or those accents sort of start to merge together. And then the first generation starts to move towards something that we might call the Australian accent. So the first generation born here in Australia. And then the accent is very much established by that second generation. So even though we don't have audio recordings of Australians that go far back enough to know what that accent sounded like, there were some recordings in New Zealand that were able to record people who had been sort of born in the 1850s, I think, very early audio recordings that kind of suggested that accent in New Zealand had kind of established itself by the middle of the 19th century. And so I think researchers are more interested in the kind of attitudes towards the accent than the details of the accent itself. The research seems to suggest that this process of dialect levelling took place here in Australia, and that by the time you've got to that second generation of Australians born here, and of course, children will pick up the accents that they hear amongst children rather than necessarily what they're hearing at home, that accent had established itself by then.
Did you find in your research around that, I guess it's sort of the 1830s, isn't it, where you're getting the second generations being born and developing this dialectical Australian accent? Are people writing home about it? I mean, are they visiting Australia or the colonies at the time and saying, oh, they sound a bit different here than they do in Shropshire or Galway?
I mean, we start to sort of pick up these little snippets of information of people talking about what people sounded like here in the colonies and also the kind of language that they used. So we can also use those kinds of snippets of information, although they're very, very much snippets. They're not really going to be an elaborate kind of research analysis of what people sounded like. They can definitely hear something distinctive, a distinctive voice here in Australia, a distinctive vocabulary start to develop as well here in Australia. So there's definitely those observations can be really helpful as well in terms of thinking about how people sounded and the kind of way in which they spoke.
And of course, there are things like the stories that have come out of that 19th century, like about the bunyip and a billabong and a swag. I mean, those are words that I presume were being developed in the Australian colonies rather than coming from the mother country.
My main research project is the Australian National Dictionary, which is a dictionary of Australianisms, where we track Australian words from their first evidence through their long history. So a word like swag, which comes into the lexicon really early, transference from the swag of the criminals. So they had their swag, which was their lot of booty that they'd stolen. Here in the colonies, less opportunities perhaps to be thieving, things from rich people. So the term gets transferred to refer to just your sort of bundle of goods that you're carrying around. So some of those words establish themselves very early in Australia. So we get our own unique senses of these words. Words borrowed from Indigenous languages, of course, really important as well in our early vocabulary. And then as time goes on, as we develop our own literature as well. So we've got our own Australian writers who are using new words to describe the landscape, new words to describe the way in which people were working, the mateship. These kinds of things all start to get written about from the middle of the 19th century. And we see this great flourishing of the Australian English vocabulary through the second half of the 19th century. And that's really the biggest expansion of the vocabulary.
And when did you see this? Because I notice in your writing you talk about these two strands of the Australian accent developing, this broad Australian accent and then the more proper British received pronunciation accent. So that developing later in the 19th century, isn't it, those two distinct strands?
Yeah, well, it seems that through the later part of the 19th century, there's this increasing preoccupation with what Australians sound like, and especially children. And so there's a lot of increasing complaint about the children speaking with this nasal accent, saying cow instead of cow, not having these lovely rounded vowels. Elocution becomes a much more important thing through the late 19th century, so that you would speak properly and effectively, public speaking being a really important part of a person's education in the late 19th century. And so when people are writing about the accent or doing more scientific studies of the accent in the 20th century, they identifiable educated accent, Australian accent, and a broad Australian accent, which is sometimes, well, actually quite often through the early part of the 20th century, often described as uneducated. So rural people were using it, or people who hadn't had proper education or hadn't had elocution classes and all of these kinds of things. And so there's definitely this division, if you like, between an educated and broad accent that's established itself by the early 20th century. And then we sort of move back to having a kind of general Australian accent. By the middle of the 20th century, linguists talking about an educated Australian accent, a general Australian accent, and a broad Australian accent. So there's kind of this spectrum, if you like, of Australian accents, but those are the three main categories. But interestingly, the first two that are identified are the educated and the broad, and it's almost this kind of opposition between the people who speak in this kind of trained way. They've had elocution classes, they do public speaking, they speak in very proper ways, and then there's more stigmatized broad accent.
Where is that broad accent coming from? Does it have links to Cockney English or Scottish or Irish? Is there a way of determining how that evolved?
It's probably likely that the broad accent was the accent that was establishing itself within those couple of generations here in Australia. And then it becomes this preoccupation with what you sound like by the end of the 19th century, which is also influenced by what's happening in Britain. So dialect or regional accents are increasingly seen as kind of deviant from the southeast England accent. which feeds into that idea of the BBC accent, which you hear by the people talking by the early 20th century, the received pronunciation. So similar things are happening in Britain, whereby regional accents are considered to be deviant from a kind of ideal accent, which is also proper speaking, rounded vowels. I'd say it would be what the royal family would sound like, but, that's not necessarily the case, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century. But that very proper accent that's establishing itself. It's also about authority. Who are the people who are in power? How are they determining what people should sound like? Who do they want to exclude from that? And so we see that happening in both Britain and Australia through really from the late 19th century and then through the first few decades of the 20th century, you see this playing itself out.
So there seems to be in that early 20th century a sense of shame over the Australian accent, that it was something to be criticised, and it's much preferred to have more of that British received accent. Was it because there was a concern that Australians might be uneducated and therefore speaking in such broad terms?
I think it's really interesting. Certainly that this British received pronunciation is held up as this ideal. But a lot of the talk about the Australian accent is just critical from, I guess, a kind of an aesthetic perspective. So there's a lot of complaints about what they call the nasal twang. So people just don't like hearing that sound, I guess. Slurring of words. There's a lot of that kind of language. So talking about slurring, talking about a slovenly way of speaking, the fact that you're not articulating yourself well enough. So there's a lot of that kind of language that's used to condemn the Australian accent and the broad Australian accent from the late 19th century through into the early 20th century, and continues. And once people start to hear themselves on radio, when they hear these voices, they're like, oh, no, we don't like listening. To an extent, it's kind of saying, oh, well, the Australian accent, the colonial accent is inferior. We don't like to listen to it. And it's, maybe shame's too strong a word. I'm not sure, but certainly feeling uncomfortable with that and thinking, if you want to be taken seriously, if you want to work in the professions, if you want to be out there public speaking, it's better to be speaking with this British received pronunciation style, which is where educated Australian comes in. They're people who've been trained, I guess. Initially, it's about elocution lessons. It's about how you speak, how you present yourself. And people aspire to that. That's how you're going to succeed in a career, then you'll train yourself to speak that way as well.
So there's a sort of an active effort not to sound like you might naturally sound, to sound a little bit more proper and British rather than to use that colloquial language that you might at home. So do people have sort of almost a home voice and then a public speaking voice?
I know even people who are older than me, but who would have gone to school in the 1960s, said that went to private schools in the 1960s, who said that they were given elocution training at school as well. So probably something you naturalize quite early on in your life. This public speaking aspect of it, I think, is really important, and what's considered to be an important part of your education if you're going to be successful in life.
I was chuckling reading some of the criticisms of the Australian accent and the reasons why the critics thought that the Australian accent was as it was. Was it an elocutionist? Hard word to say, isn't it? Elocutionist. Alexander Watson, in his book Speak Out, The Common Sense of Elocution, was he blaming the croaking of frogs in Australian ears for an Australian voice that copied their strident persistency?
Yeah, there were some fascinating theories also about where the Australian accent came from. There were those kinds of crazy speculations that said it must be, in this case, this guy who says like the croaking of frogs, and you think, where did you hear that? But people at that stage didn't really study the language in any kind of scientific way. So I think travelled around Australia promoting his books. So it was a great way to sort of hook people in to say, okay, I'm going to tell you why your accent's like this.
And then it was that years of toil in the fields meant that they were so tired. That was why there was this slur in the voice, and bustle of modern life meant that our speech was increasingly slipshod. Really? So we were so exhausted, and we had these frogs kind of ringing in our ears, and we were a bit lazy because we were Australians, so therefore we sounded the way we did.
And I think there was this really interesting thing where it was linked into character. And that idea of laziness and slovenliness is repeated so many times in some of that early writing about the accent and public attitude towards the accent. I think it's really interesting that it was kind of saying something about your character if you spoke like that, which hence the appeal, I suppose, of improving the way you spoke, of taking elocution lessons or learning how to public speak.
Amanda, did you find, though, that this was a kind of elite level conversation in a way, or was this permeating all sort of stratas of society? Because, I mean, if you were a labourer labouring in a field or, shearing in the shearing sheds, did you care at all that your accent was broad and not BBC English?
Well, I think, there certainly would have been people who wouldn't have. And of course, when you think about, the other interesting element of all of this is that the kind of quintessential Australian figures at the time are the bushmen and the bullocky drivers, and they all speak with a broad accent and use colloquial language. So there is that interesting kind of irony to all of that the kind of quintessential Australian figures are about as far from this as you can get. But I think it was about aspiration. If you did want to go into the professions, if you did aspire to work in certain places, then improving the way you spoke was important and was something that you would do. How many people that affected, I don't know, but that would have been what it was about. It was about whether you wanted to get ahead, particularly in the professions.
So radio is introduced in Australia in 1923, and that has quite a big impact on the standardisation of the Australian accent, doesn't it?
I think the interesting thing about the introduction of radio is that it's really reflecting those voices back to people.
Yeah.
A way that they'd not heard before. Yes, you might go hear a public speech or you might hear your fellow Australians speaking around you, but it really made people think about their accent, think about what an Australian voice sounded like. One of the most interesting things I think about some of the letters to the editor of radio magazines and so forth at the time through those early couple of decades was people had the same complaints about the sort of lazy nasal slurring accent. They didn't like that. But they also didn't like it if the accent was too BBC, too British, too plummy. That was not seen to be authentic either. So I think that's one of the really interesting elements of all of that. So people did want to hear an Australian voice, sort of, but they didn't want to hear the broad accent. But they were happy, for the most part, to hear an educated Australian accent. And so if you got too far into the BBC, very British sound, that also could lead to people complaining about it. So I think that's really interesting. And of course, they don't want to hear American. They're not very keen on American voices either. Not that there were many, certainly not on the ABC, maybe some on commercial radio, but people weren't very keen on that either.
The ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it seemed to play quite a cultural leadership role, didn't it, in terms of what was acceptable Australian English or not, and who was allowed to be a broadcaster on their radio programs, and the type of accent that that person would have seemed to be quite defined, didn't it, by the ABC?
Yeah, and of course the ABC is still our national broadcaster and still really important, but I think in a much more limited media landscape back then, the ABC was just centrally important and very much the ones who was kind of set the tone and set the standard. And
well, I guess just like the BBC in the UK too, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it's a public broadcaster. It's not commercial, so it's not subject to the kind of whims or other demands that the commercial stations were getting in the early days. And certainly for the ABC, having an educated accent was centrally important. You might receive training if you were a broadcaster on the ABC. So that was really an important part of the way they presented it. And it didn't become, you weren't hearing a great many diverse voices. But of course, if people were interviewed, because I think some of the politicians of the time would be interviewed and then their accents would be not necessarily the perfect educated Australian accent. It varied quite a bit. So there were other voices being heard, but the standard was being set as this educated Australian accent.
And I guess those accents as broadcasters on the national broadcaster and giving you the news, they then would be conflated with a voice of authority is a voice that sounds like that. It's sort of a British sounding Australian accent. It's a male accent, of course. They didn't really have female broadcasters at the time, did they? So you have that reinforcement through the use of these broadcasters by the ABC, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're spot on there. Women's voices were not considered to be authoritative in the way that men's voices were. The educated accent was a voice of authority in a way that a broader accent or a more diverse accent would not be considered at the time. Yes, they're kind of setting that norm and making people associate the educated Australian accent with a voice of authority. But of course, people also complained a lot if they heard these other voices on the radio. So feeding back into it by saying, oh, we don't want to listen to those voices. So yeah, it's a fascinating interplay between those two things.
So was it in that 1930s period when we had this concern that you just referred to earlier about the influence of Americanisms, American slang, American accents on the Australian form of speech and lexicography? You write about American talkies, which I assume is, I don't know what a talkie is.
Yes, a film with sound, dialogue. So the silent films come along, but then when the talkies arrive, then of course people are actually hearing the American accent in a way that they wouldn't have heard. You might have a few people coming in from America, but it wouldn't have been something people would have heard very much at all. But suddenly you've got these sound films that have come along in the 1930s, yeah. And people are hearing this American accent, often along with slang, the hip language that was used in some of the American films. And through the earlier period, during the silent film era, there was a lot of concern about the kind of immorality of what kind of morals were these American films bringing. So all of those things combine, I think, for people to be quite, well, not everybody. Obviously, lots of people embraced it. Lots of young people loved watching American films. So, but, often the older generation, I shouldn't stereotype, but often it was the older generation who were quite resistant to the influence of American culture coming in and worrying about what it was going to do about Australian morals and our speech. Increasingly, you see articles being written about the invasion of American slang and people using some of those expressions that people didn't like that were considered to be, I mean, not always, sometimes they were Australian expressions, but people kind of think, oh, I've not heard that one before, it must be American. So we still hear people complain about American slang today. So it's not gone away, but it was certainly, you see in the 1930s, the beginning of that kind of real concern about the American cultural invasion.
But what was wrong with American culture? I mean, was it because it wasn't British?
Well, I think some people would definitely have embraced it. Young people who would have adopted the slang and were quite keen to embrace it. But I think more generally, there's that sense of an invasion of American culture at some point, whereas people feel an ethnic identification, I suppose, with Britain and British language. But America is kind of seen as kind of invasive, I suppose, and also not necessarily being held up as a great ideal. So there was a perception that American slang was a sign you were uneducated. There was quite a lot of informal language, abbreviations and hip slang that people might be using that was considered to be not that ideal, that kind of educated ideal that was being held up through that period. It is a kind of interesting preoccupation, our preoccupation with America. Like, it's sort of ongoing, isn't it? I mean, we still express such hostility towards America. I started my life as a historian of America, of the United States, and I can tell you a number of people, when you say what area of history you work on, my expertise was the United States, you would get some kind of opinion, shall we say, about that and about American imperialism more generally, I guess, but cultural imperialism included. But I think it is interesting. I mean, I still think that sort of British is sort of held up as this ideal, like British way of speaking, British accent in a way that, America's not ever gained any kind of traction that way.
And I guess also this sense of we're part of that stage, say the 1930s, the British Empire, and the challenge to the cultural dominance of the empire is coming from the United States as a very successful economy, cultural exports. And so there was a defensiveness perhaps about threats to Britishness, and the British soft power was really in abeyance as opposed to what was coming out of America. I remember even as a child in the 1980s, my grandmother, who was born in the 1920s, so I guess would have been a teenager through the 30s, if ever I used the expression no way, she launched on it. I mean, she absolutely detested no way because it was an American expression. We don't say no way. You don't say toilet. You say lavatory or loo because, again, toilet was an American word. I don't know if I just always used to think it was a bit strange, and then at a sort of tried to remind myself when I'm in front of my grandmother, don't say no way, don't say toilet.
Yeah, and I think people still have their sort of bugbears about certain words as being American, even when they're not. Or pronunciations is another thing. So saying ceremony instead of ceremony will vex a whole lot of people. So I think there's, even though...
Research and research, that was another one, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And people start to forget. And in Australia, we actually use quite a lot of both, right? So we use both pronunciations. Our dictionaries, we include both those pronunciations. Usually put the British one first, the American one second, but we use both of them. But people do cling to that for whatever reason. They do want to see us as being resistant. Now, of course, we celebrate the Australian and resist the American, but I don't think we resist the British quite as much even today as we do the American.
Can you tell me about the significance of the Sydney Uni academic Alexander Mitchell? He's really someone who's encouraging Australians to be more comfortable with their own accent and embrace it as quite a good thing. But he's quite important for the 30s and 40s and 50s, isn't he, in this journey for Australians?
Yeah, so Mitchell, he went to Britain to study, and he was influenced by an academic there who was studying the British accent and regional accents there. And he came back to do a proper scientific study of the Australian accent as it was. So his first publications start to come out at the beginning of the 1940s, and then he publishes a book called The Pronunciation of English in Australia in 1946, which, even though it was quite a scientific linguistic study, was published by Angus and Robertson, which was the big Australian publisher. So, and he was on the ABC quite a lot talking about the accent. He'd spoke in the media about the accent. And he was the first to use those categories of educated and broad. So that was what his research told him, that there were people who spoke with this educated Australian accent and people who spoke with this broad Australian accent. Later, he added the category of general. So he thought more about it being on a spectrum, with many people actually sort of sitting in the middle of those two and speaking with a general Australian accent. But it was really the first based on evidence study to be made about the Australian accent. And in much of his public talking about this, he said, well, this is what we speak. We have an Australian accent. We speak with this Australian accent. He was still an advocate of the educated accent, but he didn't think that we should all be ashamed of how we spoke. And he said, we should embrace that accent. Better to be the educated end of the spectrum than the broad, mind you. But he still thought it was important to embrace that. And it was linking in at a time, it linked into ideas about Australian nationalism that are building through the 1930s and definitely are there during World War II. And another writer at the time was Sidney Baker, who he studied the Australian lexicon and wrote a book called The Australian Language, which was published in 1945. So it comes out the year before Mitchell's study of the accent. And so both of those works were really about saying we have this unique way of speaking, both accent and the words that we use, and we should embrace it. We should celebrate it. It's about us. It's about how we speak. It's about the kind of things that made us. So Baker's work on the language, on the lexicon, and I talked about all the influences, the bush and our environment and convict period, all of these things that have kind of made up our distinctive way of speaking. So I think it comes at this really important point in Australian history where Australia is really moving to a stronger sense of a kind of independent national identity, cultural identity. I mean, it's still got a ways to go, I think. I mean, there's still quite strong identification with Britain, of course, but definitely helping to kind of assert a sense of a kind of independent cultural identity that's kind of bound up in the way in which we speak and how we speak.
How important was this standing committee on spoken English that he participated in with the ABC? I mean, that sounds like it's sort of the authority of what was good and what was bad, was it?
Yeah, I mean, it was about establishing, making sure that broadcasters were trained to speak in a particular way, but it was also about standardizing things like place names. So, around Australia, people might think you pronounce Wollongong or something in different ways. That's right. And so it was about collecting that information and making sure that you had a uniform idea of pronunciation of particular words, place names, things like that across Australia. And so it does go a long way to creating this standardized version, if you like, of Australian English. We're all going to pronounce a word this way. We're all going to speak it this way. And through the early years, still quite preoccupied with making sure that broadcasters are speaking with educated Australian accents. But over time, that begins to shift.
Obviously, we still need the Standing Committee on Spoken English to standardise these things.
Well, I think it was still in place well into the 1980s. And I think quite recently, they certainly still had someone at the ABC who was responsible for this, including international things, of course, because you might need to know, a country changes its name, how you're going to pronounce it. We saw it with, I think, Kiev and things like that. So deciding how that was going to be dealt with and making sure that that happened across the ABC.
It's interesting in his 1957 book, Spoken English, he argues that 75% of Australians spoke broad Australian. So this educated Australian or general Australian accent was still very much the minority. So that broad Australian that might have been because of the influence of the croaking of frogs or our lazy, slovenly existence, it was actually basically the Australian population.
Yeah, that's right. I think that was part of the reason why the general Australian category got added in, because there was more people sitting in that general to broad category than were sitting in that educated Australian category.
One of the people whose voice we have a lot of recordings of is, of course, Robert Menzies, and a great interest to this podcast, as you can imagine. And Mitchell, he holds up the Menzies voice, doesn't he, as a good example of educated Australian English. Was there a reason why? I mean, what was it about Menzies' voice, do you think, an accent that was considered to be so good?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting going back and listening to recordings of people.
They sound so English, don't they?
Yeah. And they sound so different to voices that we would hear today, regarded of educated, broad or otherwise. I think certainly he was held up as a best example of the educated Australian accent. I think he certainly would have had admiration for the way in which Menzies spoke, a fine public speaker, but perhaps also because he thought people would know, like that would be an example that you could actually say, here's a really fine example of educated Australian, a public figure that people certainly admired, probably, certainly as a speaker. So I think it was probably the case that Menzies could be an example that everyone could kind of know what he sounded like in a way that many other public figures perhaps weren't as familiar.
I wonder, though, if it would have been seen as a bit partisan too, because Menzies is Prime Minister at the time when he's saying this, isn't he? And so you're saying, oh, well, the Prime Minister, the leader of the Liberal Party, he's the perfect Australian educated accent. But Arthur Calwell, terrible, or, Doc Everett, terrible. I mean, was that the...
Yeah, I don't know if he was trying to ingratiate himself at some level. I do know that there was, back in the 40s, I think Menzies was asked what he thought of Mitchell's work in terms of saying that we all embrace our Australian accent. And Menzies himself said that Australians should embrace the national colour of the voice. So we should be willing to accept our own unique Australian voice, but we should still be careful not to be too slovenly in our speech. So maybe he just approved of Menzies' opinions on Australian English as well.
Perhaps a mutual appreciation there. When did that cultural cringe around our accents start to dissipate? Was it something that you observe in the 50s and 60s, or are we still struggling with it? I don't think we are. But
I think that's a really interesting question, because you could kind of see that early stuff by Mitchell and people like Baker to say, okay, we have our unique way of speaking, we have our unique language that we use as being an important part of that process. And also the embrace of Australian literature, Australian art, all those kinds of things that come along with that in that period. But I think it's really in the 60s and 70s that you really see a significant shift. I've read quite a bit of, memoirs and writing by people who were on the stage through that period. And they said voices, the theatrical stage, really started to shift in that time, in the 1960s and into the 1970s. You were suddenly hearing a whole diverse range of voices. And you've got playwrights like Alec Buzo and David Williamson who are really embracing Australian themes that they write about, but also those Australian voices on the stage. And you're hearing that also in television, so a great deal of diversity in voices in television. And those strictures that say all broadcasters ought to sound the same, I think starts to change as well through that period. And so you're hearing a much more diverse, and there's a much more diverse media landscape, I guess. So you're hearing a lot more diversity in terms of the kinds of voices that you hear. But along with that, you've got those quintessential Australian figures, the ochre, coming along in the 1970s as well, who are kind of like rudely Australian, right? They're using bad language, the Bazza McKenzie and people like that who are really just totally rejecting.
And is that the first time in the 70s when we start to hear the broad Australian accent in broadcast on television, on the radio? Is that where it becomes acceptable to broadcast that, or is it only broadcast then in a sort of derogatory way?
I mean, that's a really interesting question because, I think arguably you've sort of got those broad voices going back to the sort of Dad and Dave radio programs and the movie version of They're a Weird Mob, which I think is, must be the early 1960s, also has these working class Aussie figures in that movie as well. So those, and Hollywood films, Chips Rafferty and people like that who used quite a broad accent. So they are around. And arguably even the ochre figure, he was a caricature. He was a kind of exaggeration of this figure. But I think it was going some way to certainly increasing the diversity of those voices, but perhaps also normalizing those voices and a lot of people embracing the ochre. We look back on it now and think, oh gosh, so kind of extreme and sexist and all the rest of it. But certainly at the time, a lot of people kind of like to embrace the ochre because it was such a yours to Britain and to other figures of authority and all of those kinds of things. So by the time you get to the 1980s, we really just have this great diversity of voices that we hear on radio, on television, on stage, and less preoccupation, I think, less of a kind of preoccupation with no, you can't speak like that. Still, people will complain about pronunciation or accent, but I think most of those, we're no longer devoting whole pages of newspapers to a debate about what's a proper Australian accent.
Even so, though, as a child of the 80s, I don't really remember very, very strong, broad Australian accents on the ABC, for example. All the broadcasters of that, people like Laurie Oakes, they all sounded pretty educated Australian English, a certain tone of voice. And
yeah, I agree with that. And I think it is interesting because that broad accent, even today, kind of continues on as a performance thing. It's that we know we might even embrace or endorse, but we wouldn't necessarily ourselves want to speak that way, I think. You saw these sort of characters like Alf on Home and Away, who's often held up as sort of like the new, well, not the new ochre, but, he uses like flamin' galah or those kinds of expressions, which we know is kind of quintessentially Australian, but how many of us actually use them? There might be some people who certainly do without it being self-conscious or ironic.
Well, and it's interesting, I just reflect on more recent personalities who use those really Australian colloquialisms. Like Kevin Rudd used to use them quite a bit, but with an educated Australian accent at the same time, which also sounded a bit incongruous.
Yeah. Well, that's true as well. So there's this question about authenticity.
Yes.
So Bob Cat or some of the
Jackie Lambie
can embrace that kind of language quite effectively because it is of a piece with their political persona. But for others, it can be a bit, as you say, incongruous that you just think, well, why are they using that? Why are they using those expressions? And then they get accused of being inauthentic, of course, because they're just putting it on. That's trying to make it.
Amanda, I'm very interested in the role multicultural Australia has had to play on our accent. We've had waves of migration, of course, for 250 years, but particularly in the 50s, we see a lot of Eastern, Southern Europeans coming into Australia and then migrants from Asia in the 70s and 80s. And now we're seeing these days a lot of migrants, say, from China and from India coming. How does that influence the Australian accent and the Australian slang and lexicography?
And that's a really interesting question. I know that there is work that's being done at the moment on looking at the diversity of Australian accents amongst migrant communities. There's a lot of work that's been done on Western Sydney. So it'll be really interesting to see the results, so that there are some distinctive accents that are being used in particular places with high levels of migrant communities, like Western Sydney. It's the one I can think of where a lot of work has been done in recent times. But I think for the most part in Australia, the idea of Australian English was so powerful, and the idea that you should assimilate yourself into that. I think we had a very strong assimilationist culture through the middle of the century when the Eastern European and Southern European migrants were coming in after World War II. That much of it was about, well, firstly, speaking English, but then speaking Australian English, ideally more educated than broad. So there was some preoccupation. We don't want recently arrived migrants learning English and then speaking too much slang and things like that. So you do see some preoccupations with that. But I think that assimilationist culture was so strong through those decades that it made Australian English very much the norm that migrants had to assimilate themselves into. But the work that's being done at the moment, I think, might show that there might be more diversity occurring in some of the accents that migrant communities are speaking.
I mean, you see in popular culture too, in portrayals of, say, children of Italian migrants having a particular Australian accent, that it is Australian English they're speaking, but it has a flavour that would be different from the accent you and I would have.
Yes, that's correct. And so, yeah, and I mean, sometimes that also is part of a kind of performance of a particular ethnic Australian identity. And those kind of programs like Acropolis Now and Wogs Out of Work are kind of a great example of that. So, yeah, there's definitely that diversity at the sort of local and community levels. But, I think it's interesting to think about whether that's actually had an influence on the dominant Australian accent. And I'm not sure that it has, but that may change in future generations. But we'll wait and see whether it does.
I think the reality is the accent does keep changing, doesn't it? Even in my lifetime, your lifetime, it has changed. I listened to recordings from the early 80s. People do sound quite different, even in the space of 40 years. And it's just, I guess, the nature of our society and the influences coming from overseas. As people who come to Australia assimilate, we also assimilate as Australians, don't we?
Yes, that's right.
Well, Amanda, it's been absolutely fascinating having this discussion. And I really appreciate you coming on Afternoon Light and sharing all your insights and research with our audience.
Great. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.